capitalism can never stay home. It goes abroad. The ordinary people simply paid the cost of empire.
In 1877, the British Empire, already notorious by this point for being a murderous colonial power, set its sights on a new prize, the mineral-rich Transvaal Republic. Under the guise of protection, Sir Theophilus Shepstone, the empire's cunning operative, orchestrated a brazen annexation of the sovereign state. On April 12, 1877, Shepstone proclaimed British rule over the Transvaal, ignoring previous treaties and the will of its people. This audacious land grab sparked outrage among the Boers, who were themselves colonial Dutch settlers. This led to the First Anglo-Boer War in 1880, and despite initial setbacks including the humiliating defeat at Majuba Hill, the empire's vast resources eventually overwhelmed the Boer resistance. The discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886 only intensified British greed. Tensions escalated as the empire sought to control its newfound wealth, culminating in the infamous Jameson Raid of 1895, a failed coup attempt backed by Cecil Rhodes, England's ambitious diamond magnate. The British Empire's need for control over its territories led to the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1899. It was during this brutal conflict that the British invented concentration camps, where thousands of Boer women and children perished. The war ended in 1902, with the Boer republics absorbed into the British Empire. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed, ostensibly granting self-governance, but effectively maintaining British control. The empire's legacy of racial segregation laid the groundwork for the apartheid system, implemented in 1948 by the National Party. For decades, the international community turned a blind eye to the segregationist regime. It wasn't until the 1980s, after decades of mounting global pressure and internal resistance, led by groups like Umkhonto Wesiwe, that the system began to crumble. The empire's crime spree known as apartheid in South Africa finally came to an end in 1994 with the country's first democratic elections. Nelson Mandela, once labeled a terrorist by the British government, became president, marking the official end of apartheid, although the economic and cultural effects would continue to be felt for decades. So that's basically an overview of colonization in South Africa up until the end of the actual official apartheid system. But as I said, it has a lot of remaining legacies and after effects that have persisted.
Yeah.
And what's ironic about South Africa is that even people who were anti-colonial people like James Connolly, a famous Irish Marxist, was on the side of the Boers because they were unfortunately being persecuted by the British Empire, even though the Boers themselves were Dutch colonial settlers who had persecuted the natives and enslaved them. So it's kind of ironic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I was kind of brushing up on some of this, and it's really crazy how they basically formed their own miniature slave trade. You know, we've got like the transatlantic slave trade between the Americas and the European powers in Africa, but they formed their own down there connecting to Indonesia and like India, and they brought in brown labor to be enslaved along with native Africans at the same time. So it's just really, really bloody and nasty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then they got Indian people involved. They went over to Indonesia. They had a colonial settlement there. And so once they started English settlements in South Africa, they started trading enslaved people around from all their settlements and all their territories, and a lot of times on purpose to keep people from developing any connections that could lead to some kind of revolt or resistance.
I don't know why these guys with goofy sounding names always turn out to be the worst guys in history. This guy's like, I'm Sir Theophilus Shepstone, and I invented concentration camps. It's like, what the fuck's going on with it? Like, what a goofy fucking name. Like, the British are a deeply unserious people. I don't know what to... Oh, so... Wait, is Theophilus British? Yeah, he is.
Yeah,
that guy was British. Why did the Dutch go there if the British annexed South Africa?
Well, so no, I mean, the Dutch were there first, and the British were like, well, we want that, because like they were all at war anyway.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
right. Actually, that was the first war Australia fought in, the Boer War.
You dicks, of course you did.
Yeah,
Oh my
no, we
God.
had to. No, we got called up for that was the first war Australia had to fight
Mhm.
overseas. That is, obviously, we had fought quote unquote wars within the borders of Australia.
With the
In
emus.
brackets, no genocide of
Yeah,
Indigenous people.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, the first overseas war was the Boer War, and yeah, we had to kill Dutch people, which you know.
Yeah. sounds about
I
right.
mean,
They-
Dutch people, they fucking deserved it if they were also
Yep.
imperialists.
Yeah, I remember watching this movie as a kid called Zulu, which is also set in South Africa about the Battle of Rorke's Drift, and being like, damn, the movie depicts the British people as like the good guys defending their camp against the Zulus, and it's like, why the fuck were they there?
It's like modern Marvel movies,
Yeah. I was like, why are there a bunch of pasty white boys in Africa shooting people who are from Africa? But the movie's like framing it as these are the brave defenders of Rorke's Drift. And it's like, I don't know, it seems to me like you guys shouldn't be there. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did the Zulus have a right to defend themselves?
Do Zulus have a right to exist?
Yeah.
All right, so let's go back to the beginning here. So if we really want to start at the beginning of Europe's imposition on South Africa, we can go back to 1498, when Portuguese merchant explorer Vasco da Gama first sailed around the southern African Cape. While not settled formally for the next 2 centuries, it was known as the Cape of Good Hope because it was important in European trade with Asia. Sailors to and from Europe and the Far East used it as a convenient stopping place for restocking their ships with food and fresh water. The comfortable climate at the Cape made it unfortunately conducive for European settlement. In 1652, Jan van Riebeck, representing the Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC, founded the Cape Colony at Table Bay. When the Dutch first arrived, they initially engaged in trade with the Khoi people. The Dutch exchanged tobacco, brandy, and other goods for fresh meat from Khoi herders. At first, this trade relationship was beneficial for both parties, as the Dutch needed supplies for their ships and the Khoi gained access to new goods. It was Dutch encroachment and expansion into areas around Table Bay and beyond that resulted in conflicts with the Khoi. Dutch perceptions of land as a commodity with monetary value, which could be privately owned, exchanged, or sold, was at odds with Khoi views of land and grazing pastures as property of the community, not individuals. They had no concept of private ownership of land, they just let their cattle graze. This is highlighted by the early tensions over land occupied by the Dutch around the castle area. For instance, in 1655, when the Khoi built their shelter and grazed their cattle close to the fort, the Dutch attempted to chase them away. The Khoi refused to move, declaring that the land was theirs and that they would attack the Dutch if they were not permitted to graze their cattle or build their huts wherever they chose. The Dutch continued to order the Khoi to graze their cattle out of sight of the fort and company settlement. The VOC further insulted the native people by granting land to free burghers on the Saldanha Bay, Swartland, and Table Bay. Van Riebeck also ordered the planting of bitter almond trees, brambles, and thorn bushes as boundaries along farms to keep the Khoi cattle out of quote-unquote company-owned land. The Khoi were also restricted in their movement, as they were forced to walk designated footpaths and use designated gates when entering the fortified area.
That is wild.
Yeah, they just started like literally enclosure all over again. They were like, we encountered this in feudalism, we're going to do this again.
Yep.
These were lands that were grazing routes seasonally used by the Khoi. The loss of grazing pastures became a constant source of friction between the Khoi and Dutch. Van Riebeck noted that the Khoi leaders complained and even conceded that, quote, "We had been appropriating more and more of their land, which had been theirs all these centuries, and on which they had been accustomed to let their cattle graze. It would be of little consequence if you people stayed here at the fort, but you come right into the interior and select the best land for yourselves without even asking whether we mind or whether it will cause us any inconvenience. As for your claim that the land is not big enough for us both, who should in justice rather give way, the rightful owner or the foreign intruder?" So he was himself quoting the Khoi there and saying that they had obviously the rightful case and like the moral authority over this land, but they were just going to do it anyway, so as they do.
This is sounding pretty familiar.
One notable leader of the Khoi resistance was Domon. His Khoi name was Nomoa, but he is more commonly known by the name the Dutch gave him. He was one of 2 interpreters employed by the Dutch at the suggestion of their first interpreter, a Khoi chief, Altshumato, to act for the Dutch whilst Altshumato was absent from the settlement. The other was Kaikana Makukoa, known as Krotoa, or Klaas Dos to the Dutch. Jan van Riebeck's diarist noted that Domon, quote, "seems to be well disposed towards us, and is serving the honorable company better than anybody else up to the present at any rate." So even in his compliments of the guy, he's like still kind of backhanded. Fucking Dutch people.
Yeah, dude, I would say Dutch names are even like harder to pronounce.
Oh, of course.
It's really hard to take Dutch people seriously. I find it's really hard to understand that they were capable of these kinds of evils when they have stupid names like the Burgers. They're called the Burgers, and then what a fake and dumb language. I don't think the Netherlands, like Dutch is the Netherlands, right?
Oh yeah.
The
Yeah.
Netherlands. Dutch people are from. Yeah, they shouldn't be allowed to have a country. That's my stance.
That's fine. Yeah, I'll go with that.
I was trying to figure out before while I was kind of reading along, and the VOC, the Dutch East India Trading Company, it's like Verenigde Oostindische Company. Like,
Yeah,
I
what a
just
fake
butchered it there.
Yeah. No, it doesn't matter. It deserves to be butchered because it's not a real language.
Jared, are you telling me if you met a guy named Riekelof von Coins, you wouldn't take him seriously?
No, I don't. I would take him seriously if he was like a carny at a fucking festival or something. But that's about it.
Well, that's our next guy. Riekelof von Coins, advising von Riebeck on defense matters, took Doman to Java in the Dutch East Indies in April 1657, where he witnessed how the local people had been forced to submit to Dutch rule. The trip was intended to teach Doman the commercial business of the company, but is thought to have caused Doman to understand the threat the Dutch posed to the Khoikhoi way of life. During the trip, he witnessed the resistance attempted by the Bantamese against the Dutch in North Java. To ensure his safe return to the Cape, Doman told Commissioner Joan Cuneus, I guess it's another weird Dutch name.
Is it a Juan?
Oh, probably it's Johan Cuneus. I'm sure it's like the Dutch version.
Yeah.
So he told Commissioner Johan Cuneus of his wish to become a Christian, and of the fact that he had become so devoted to the Dutch that he doubted whether he could live with his fellow Khoisan again. This was a ploy, and almost as soon as he landed, he emerged as the staunchest Khoikhoi critic of Van Riebeck's policies. When Van Riebeck seized several Khoisan leaders as hostages in 1658, Doman was the lone protester. The Khoisan chiefs themselves welcomed imprisonment as an opportunity to enjoy Dutch hospitality. They were already institutionalized, I guess. They were in prison too long.
It's systemic right from the start.
He was particularly scathing in his criticism of Eva, a Khoisan girl adopted by the Dutch, tauntingly calling out whenever she passed by, quote, "See, there comes the advocate of the Dutch. She will tell her people some stories and lies and will finally betray them all." Whenever Eva tried to pass information to the Dutch, Doman tried to stop her. When the Dutch planned trips into the hinterland, he tried to stop them. From his hut near the fort, he tried to intercept all inland visitors. Unfortunately for Doman, his earlier attempts to make Khoisan trade with the Dutch the exclusive preserve of the peninsular groups left him dangerously short of allies. Thus his attempts to persuade local chief Gogosoa to attack the Dutch was bluntly refused. Without the help of the inland Cochoqua, an attack on the fort was doomed to fail. Doman, however, was able to persuade some of the younger leaders to join him in what he regarded as a war of liberation. So on a cold and drizzling day on May 19, 1659, the Khoikhoi conducted a series of raids on the Free Burghers' herds. Doman had waited for rainy weather, knowing that the Dutch matchlock muskets could not be fired in the rain with damp powder. The First Khoikhoi-Dutch War followed. It lasted almost a year and resulted in only a few deaths. Initiative lay chiefly with the Khoisan, who attacked, often in groups of several hundred. Instructed by Doman, who had witnessed Dutch military tactics in Java, they darted about erratically to frustrate Dutch marksmen. Commander von Riebeck responded with defensive tactics, withdrawing the Free Burghers to the fort, temporarily arming the slaves, an extraordinarily risky measure, and building a strong kraal to protect the colony's remaining livestock. Lacking firearms and unwilling to storm the central fort, the Khoikhoi eventually signaled their willingness to parley. A peace was negotiated. The war had ended in stalemate. The Khoisan returned no livestock seized in the war and paid no reparations, yet they did accept the continued European occupation of the Cape Peninsula, a threat to their perseverance as an independent people. The Dutch erected fortified posts and planted almond hedges, some of which still survive, to prevent cattle being driven off again. Khoisan were obliged to use specified routes and paths and to enter the settlement only at certain guarded gaps in the hedge. Horses which arrived from Batavia gave the colonists the mobility they had lacked in the war, and expeditions from the fort became longer and more frequent. As trading contacts were established with more Khoikhoi groups, the settlement gradually became independent of the peninsular Khoisan, whose wealth and importance waned rapidly.
It's a very unfortunate thing that we only know with the hindsight of like modern history, now that we are aware of all these examples of colonialism, is that you just can't, if you're an indigenous people in the process of being colonized, you just can't give concessions to the colonizers. You can't make deals with them. You just can't, because they're just going to continuously take more and more land, and they use concessions that you give them as an opportunity to be like, okay, we'll ease off for like a little bit, and then in a couple of years we'll do our next level of expansion, and then they'll compromise again, and then we'll do our next level of expansion, and and that's like the ongoing sort of process where it's not all in one go.
Yep.
Like realistically, with the benefit of hindsight, they should have just been shot as soon as, not shot, well, they didn't have guns, but you know what I mean? They should have just been killed as soon as they stepped off the boats. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It sounds horrible to say. I mean, it's not horrible to say. They fucking deserve it. But like, what's his face? The Spanish dickhead who colonized Christopher Cucumbers or whatever the fuck his name is. Christopher Columbus, Benedict Cumberbatch. He when he went down to there, yeah, Cucumbers. As soon as he stepped off the boats, the native people should have just killed his ass. Same with Captain Cook. As soon as he stepped off the boat in Australia, they should have speared his ass straight away.
It's okay. We can say we're white.
Yeah. I mean, dude, like it's the same thing that's going on in Israel, you know, and since the occupation started, even before the founding of the state of Israel, it's like they were showing up, carrying out terrorist campaigns to confuse the populace and displace them. And it's just settler colonialism in the United States. The same fucking thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a reason we're talking about this while things are going on in Gaza right now, because it is the same situation. The parallel between apartheid in South Africa and the similar but probably more restrictive and now genocidal system of apartheid that has been going on in Gaza has been talked about by a lot of people. We're obviously not the first to draw that parallel here. But it also just shows why the people who are the resistance in Gaza or in Palestine more broadly, the people who are in Iran, any of the people who are in any of the Islamic countries that are fighting Israel, they have a word for the normalizers. They call them normalizers. They're like anybody who is willing to make deals, even the people who have been in charge for a long time, they have all been normalizers. And you'll see the people who are willing to be militant and call them out. Sometimes Israel assassinates those people, particularly because they realize that they are using some piercing rhetoric when they say that, like, you just cannot make any deals with the colonists. You simply cannot negotiate with these terrorists. They are correct in that position.
Yeah.
Well, look at the complete failure of the two-state solution.
Yeah.
Right? That's another example of a compromise where the two-state solution is more or less exactly the same as Native Americans' treaties with the United States government, right?
Yeah.
You make this treaty, one side is acting in good faith, the Palestinians and all the Native Americans, but the other side is just like, yeah, well, whatever. Yeah, sure, yeah, you can have a state. We'll have two states. You can have your own state. And then as soon as they get the chance, they just take it. And that's basically what's happened. They cool off for a little bit, and then they come out and do the next period of expansion. It just seems like colonization plays out exactly the same in every single country. They use the same playbook, which is expansion followed by compromise, followed by expansion, followed by compromise. And the compromise, I'm using compromise in inverted commas because it's not a good deal for indigenous people. It never is.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of Maoist China dealing with Japanese imperialism, where their only solution was to fight back as hard as they possibly could. And then they were actually successful in that. That's like a kind of an example of that strategy that you're talking about, where like they should have just started killing them as soon as they showed up. And that's kind of what, I mean, they had compradors and people that were like willing to work with the imperialists as well, similar to what you were talking about.
Yeah, imagine if they just let the Japanese have Manchuria. It was Manchuria, wasn't it? Yeah. Imagine if they just let them have it and be like, okay, you can just have Manchuria. It's like the Japanese would never just stop at Manchuria. And if they did, that's still a sovereign part of China. And today, you know, in a hypothetical alternate history, today it would probably still be part of Japan if they had made that compromise, you know?
Yeah.
Just like you have Taiwan, which is the same sort of thing. It's like you let people chill out on that bit of land that they're squatting on, because that's what they are. Like colonizers are just squatters. They're not going to leave.
Well, let's not get into Taiwan just yet. So let's get back to South Africa.
Yep.
So the failure of the Khoisan to drive out the Dutch shattered Domon's position as a leader, and he was tolerated only because his people needed him as an interpreter. When he died in December 1663, the company diarist recorded, quote, "For his death, none of us will have cause to grieve, as he has been in many respects a mischievous and malicious man towards the company." So it sucks. He was doing some noble things, trying to lead his people into resistance against these occupiers, but when you have the company man record your epitaph, of course he's not going to be too generous to you, even if they did use you for your entire life as an interpreter. But yeah, it's kind of a sad end for our boy Domon here, but respect to his leadership as a war on the Dutch. I appreciate it.
We stand Domon.
After the war, Dutch settlers continued to take more and more Khoikhoi land, and by 1676, the Khoikhoi were excluded from even residing in the area near the castle. The number of buildings in the settlement grew, and European visitors began to refer to it as a town. The expansion was so evident that the VOC complained in 1661 that Van Riebeeck was establishing a colony and a town, a plan that had been discouraged by the company. But by the 1670s, the VOC committed itself to establishing a permanent settlement at the Cape. The growing influence of the British and the French, who also had interests in the Indian Ocean, posed a danger that they might lay claim to the Cape because of its strategic location. Before the Dutch, in 1670, the French attacked Saldanha Bay, exposing the vulnerability of the settlement. When war broke out between the United Provinces of the Netherlands against both Britain and France, the VOC declared itself the rightful owner of the Cape District, which included Table Bay, Hout Bay, and Saldanha Bay in 1672. The Dutch claimed that they had purchased the land from Osing Kima, leader of the Khoikhoi group, known as the Goringaiqua, with brandy, tobacco, and bread. Thus, the order to set up a permanent settlement was an attempt by the Dutch to exclude the British, with whom the Dutch were at war. So this is all the telltale signs. Like you're saying, they use the same tactics every time they do colonialism. They just said that they bought the land from this Khoikhoi leader. There's no record whether they even did or not, but either way, this is a comprador like you were talking about, this guy who was already making deals with the Dutch. So they very well could have, but the fact that they would use some brandy, tobacco, and bread to buy this land that they're going to then keep for centuries afterwards, it's exactly the same as Americans using beads, like all the other bullshit that they always do with people who either do not have a concept of private ownership of land or are speaking for people they do not represent for generations to come afterward. It's so horrific every time.
It really is.
As Dutch settlers and thus conflict spread further inland, Khoi and San communities living as hunter-gatherers also joined the resistance against Dutch expansion. During this period, frontier Dutch settlers, or trekboers, began to organize voluntary local militias called commandos that would mobilize for raids and defense. They would then disband, and this would allow the Khoisan to renew their attacks. Organized between 1700 and 1715, the first commandos consisted mostly of the company's employees with a few settler volunteers. While the first entirely civilian commando was formed in 1715, these groups remained dependent upon the company for ammunition. In 1739, commando service became compulsory for all frontier settlers, who often brought along Khoisan servants or sent them as substitutes. Khoisan commando members were armed and received a share of captured livestock. Commando leaders were not required to get permission before raising a force for an operation, but simply had to submit a report on return. According to historian Susan Newton King, quote, "The commando was an institution well suited to the guerrilla warfare favored by the Khoisan. Its loose command structure rendered it highly flexible and capable of almost immediate response to surprise attack or robbery." However, this did not stop the resistance, which continued until the end of the 18th century, as some Khoikhoi and San leaders formed alliances to raid Dutch farmers. Resistance became more isolated and fragmented as commandos killed more people and captured women and children, who were in turn used as indentured labor. The shortage of slaves led to the incorporation of the Khoikhoi and San laborers into the economy. So now you see another parallel. They become more desperate. They cannot beat this insurgents even after a couple centuries, so now they start capturing and enslaving women and children. Another obvious parallel to brutal occupation that we see today.
And also the use of settlers to do military action rather than official military bodies, because you can, as the Dutch sort of authority in that area, you can kind of wipe your hands clean of anything. It's the same with when North America was colonized as well, as the settlers. The US Army did not do the majority of the sort of expansion, really. It was settlers in individual areas getting together, and then they would go and just massacre a village of people and take the land. And that was a gradual process. And obviously the military played roles in actually arming and paying those people as well. Oftentimes the military would go out and do the massacres as well, but for the most part, it was individual settlers. And it looks like it's played out in South Africa as well.
Yeah, they definitely encouraged regular artisans, sort of like working class people, like, oh, if you come over here, we'll incentivize you to have your own land and you'll have resources here you don't have in your home country, you know, come here and we'll help you out when you settle. It's really messed up.
Yeah, and this is also what leads to the obsession with property rights, because the whole promise is you come over here, you can homestead, we will protect your property rights first and foremost. And then they encourage the settlers to go into land that native people are living on, to treat them as savages, kill them, and then the army will back you up, where it becomes an incursion as opposed to just sending the army in to be the aggressor. Now they can claim self-defense, and this is what they've always done. And this is why libertarians in America, even still, come from that settler tradition of killing brown people, and that's why they care about their homestead and their property borders and their fucking guns. Like, that's what they're all about.
Libertarians are so fucking stupid. I just can't deal with it, man.
They just don't have critical thinking abilities. But anyway, Jared, were you about to say something before I interrupted you? Before we get back to this?
Oh, I was just going to say that the groups of people who make up settlers are often the lowest strata of society in their countries that they come from. So, using North America and Australia as examples, Irish and Scottish background people generally were the settlers. I don't know who the underclass of the Dutch would have been, but I imagine most of the people who moved to South Africa who were Dutch were not rich people, because rich people would have been, they don't want to go, because it is somewhat dangerous for the settlers, right? It's a risk. It's still a risk to go colonize somewhere. So the rich people generally don't want to go. They want to benefit from it, but they're going to stay in their home country usually. Or if they go, they're in some kind of capacity that keeps them safe.
Yeah.
The foot soldiers are the poor people that they don't give a shit about.
Or even the native people themselves, as we're seeing.
Yeah, that's the other thing as well, the native people as well. And, in the United States, I'm reading a book about the colonization of the United States and the use of African American soldiers to carry out the genocide of Native Americans as well.
Dividing the working class. Yeah.
Yeah, they weren't slaves at that point, but they weren't much better than that. But yeah, dividing the working class, having one oppressed group genocide another oppressed group. Yeah.
Yeah, they love to do that shit. Well, speaking of dividing the working class, as Dutch settlement expanded north, there was a period of intense Khoisan guerrilla warfare beyond the Piketberg Mountains during the 1730s, and violence in that area continued for the rest of the century. Eastward Dutch expansion across the arid Karoo and into the rich grazing land between the Gamtoos and Fish Rivers led to another protracted period of conflict from the 1770s to 1790s that disrupted the settler meat industry. In the northeast, particularly in the Sneeberg area, violence between, quote, Bushmen hunters, independent Khoisan, and Trekboer herders in the early 1770s caused many of the latter to abandon their farms. In 1774, a grand commando of 100 Europeans and 150 Khoisan swept the area, killing 503 Bushmen and capturing 241. Between 1786 and 1795, there was an almost constant state of warfare in the northeast, and commandos killed 2,480 Bushmen and captured 654. And the Bushmen killed 276 of the Boers' Khoisan herders. Khoisan military resistance failed because they did not produce iron weapons or tools, and the Dutch quickly banned trading iron with them. And the scale of their political organization was small, making it easy for the Dutch to set groups against one another. Additionally, imported smallpox sharply reduced the Khoisan population, such as during the epidemic of 1713. Another notable and familiar aspect of imperialism. The Dutch had the advantage of horses, giving them greater mobility, range, and speed, and firearms that had both a physical and psychological impact. The Khoisan learned that they could counter Dutch firepower by adopting hit-and-run ambush tactics, and that the guns of that period would not work in the rain. Although the Khoisan reliance on livestock represented a weakness, as these could be easily stolen by mounted settlers, groups that had lost their cattle and resorted to hunting and gathering proved more adept at guerrilla tactics. By the 1670s, the Khoisan had begun to acquire a limited number of guns through trade and capture, and this led to a series of Dutch prohibitions on trading firearms with the Khoisan that were often ignored. A major factor in these conflicts was that since the Trekboers lacked capital to employ wage labor, they captured Khoisan women and children for indentured service. With the beginnings of enslavement of South African native people, the distinction must be made between pre-colonial quote-unquote slavery in Africa and slavery as we know it from European colonialism. While there were intercommunity conflicts in pre-colonial Africa, and even forms of indentured servitude, this pales in comparison to the industrialized and racialized system of exploitation the Dutch and later British would impose. European-imposed chattel slavery was fundamentally different. It was driven primarily by economic motives rather than being a byproduct of existing social structures. The unpaid labor from slavery was a cornerstone of capitalist development in Europe and the Americas, while pre-colonial African slavery did not serve the same economic function. The scale was also unprecedented, involving the forced migration of millions of Africans. The transatlantic slave trade was far more extensive and systematized than any pre-existing forms of slavery in Africa or anywhere else in the world. European chattel slavery had far-reaching, devastating effects on African development. Unlike pre-colonial forms, it led to severe population decline, disease expansion, and the proliferation of wars between African kingdoms. And unlike pre-colonial indentured service, chattel slavery treated enslaved Africans as property, stripping them of all rights and humanity. European slavery deliberately severed cultural ties and identities, whereas pre-colonial forms often allowed for some cultural continuity. In some pre-colonial African societies, enslaved individuals could be integrated into the community over time, unlike the permanent hereditary nature of chattel slavery. All too often, this difference in the millions of lives lost or affected over the centuries are dismissed by defenders of European slavery. With the mere mention of pre-colonial conflicts, the supposition being that a place must be a utopia without any conflict or dissent among native people, and if not, this would somehow justify kidnapping and enslaving them for centuries. And I just had to make this last side note here because whenever you talk about slavery in Africa, the beginning of European imposed chattel slavery, the common refrain from people who want to defend European chattel slavery, who want to defend European colonialism, or who are just plain white nationalists will be that African people sold themselves, that they had conflicts in pre-colonial times amongst each other, that they had slavery amongst each other because they had different communities that would enslave each other as a result of wars. But as I've just outlined here, it was not the same in any way whatsoever. The scale was completely different. And for all these different reasons, it's just not something that makes sense, though, to the unanalytical, the person who does not have the ability to critical think and can only think in simplistic forms of, well, they had done some bad things themselves, so therefore it was right for Europeans to colonize and enslave them.
It's actually the most brainless thing in the world, and I've heard it often from people. It's like, oh, but bad thing happened, so when we do bad thing, that's fine. It's like, oh, you're just very stupid, aren't you? Like,
Yeah,
if you think that.
It's another way that they justify the existence of capitalism itself, because without slavery, you have no modern capitalist system that was integral to its material development, historically speaking.
And it still is.
And it still is. It's still a huge part of it. Nestle and Hershey's are currently still using slave labor.
And the
It's wild.
lithium mines in the Congo.
Dude,
as well.
seriously. Yeah, your iPhone, dude. It's they require child labor to gather resources in the cobalt mines, and then that goes off to China to make the battery, and then you get your phone in the United States. It's like the whole interconnected system of super exploitation is very far-reaching and has really deep historical roots.
Mm.
Yeah, but some of that labor in China is very cheap, so therefore the Communist Party is terrible and we should never support them. We got to keep supporting American imperialism.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Let me wrap this up. I just have a couple more paragraphs, and then the next episode we could start talking about the Zulu Wars. But just to wrap this up here. In 1795, the British, who were at war with France, invaded the Cape Peninsula from False Bay and took over the Cape, including Cape Town, from the Dutch until 1803, when the colony was handed back to the Dutch. When war between the British and French broke out once more in 1806, the British permanently occupied the Cape Colony. From 1816 to the late 1850s, the British and Zulu native people engaged in a series of conflicts. During this period, the Zulu Kingdom, led by powerful leaders such as Shaka Zulu, had developed formidable fighting forces. Shaka Zulu, who ruled from 1816 to 1828, played a significant role in shaping the Zulu Kingdom's military prowess. His legacy continued to influence Zulu warfare and leadership throughout the 19th century, including during the conflicts with the British and Boers. In the 1830s, migrating Boer settlers came into conflict with the Zulu Kingdom, then ruled by Dingane, Shaka's successor. This led to a series of skirmishes and battles, including the Battle of Nkome River, or Blood River, in 1838. The Zulu, initially successful in repelling the Europeans, were eventually overpowered by the Boers. The Boer attacks on the Zulu Kingdom precipitated a Zulu civil war between Dingane and Mpande, Shaka's half-brother. Mpande emerged victorious and ruled the kingdom until his death in 1872. In the late 1850s, the British began to exert their influence in the region, leading to further conflicts with the Zulu. The British annexation of Natal in 1843 and the subsequent expansion of British territory brought the Zulu Kingdom into direct conflict with the British colonial interests. These early conflicts between the British and Zulu set the stage for the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, which would ultimately lead to the defeat of the Zulu Kingdom and its absorption into the British Empire. From 1860 to the early 1910s, thousands of laborers and traders arrived from India, forebears of the majority of South Africa's current Indian population. And in 1867, diamonds were discovered at Kimberley. And that
There they are.
begins our next series.
Oh, man. What a fucked up history.
It's very fun to go through this because in the writing process for these notes, I'm obviously researching this for myself. As I'm writing it, I don't know things about South Africa other than it's got a similar colonial history to every other British and Dutch colonized place. All I know is what the immortal science tells me about pattern recognition of colonialism, right? So I'm researching this, and then at every turn, like here at the Zulu part, the next episode will be expanded versions of all these paragraphs on the Zulu War. And all of it is super interesting. Like the fact that these were real people who had real lives, and then these were their struggles for freedom against colonial invaders. And if you have any interest in this kind of stuff, it's powerful stuff to read about. It's very affecting. And I really love reading about the people who were fighting with their lives for the same struggles that we're unfortunately still dealing with today. So
Yeah. I mean, imagine we're witnessing the genocide of the Palestinians on our phones and we're able to see the suffering in real time. I can't even imagine being able to see exactly with my own eyes through a computer screen what the Zulus were going through, what the Khoi Khoi were going through. You know, the level of barbarity of the colonial powers inflicting such crazy amounts of violence on native populations. Like I can't even imagine. I mean, I have a better idea now given recent events, but you know.
Yeah, another thing people are saying a lot nowadays is that this is what colonialism was always like, just now we have cameras for it.
Yep, exactly.
I'd be tempted to say, oh man, imagine if we had cameras and phones back then, how much of a difference would it make? But then you watch, we have cameras
not
and
making
phones
much
now, and it's not
Yeah.
it's not making a
It's
difference.
so sad, isn't it?
Everyone knows, but like you can put genocide in front of people in like 4K sharp detail. You can watch kids get blown to pieces by Israeli and American weapons. You can see the people say, yeah, I was in prison and I got molested and raped by Israeli concentration camp guards. You can hear that. You can see all that. You can see the photos. You can see the videos. And despite that, it just seems like so many people don't acknowledge it or deny it.
A lot of liberals view it or they see it or they outright deny it. And they say like, you know, what can I do about it? You know, they have such like an individualist thinking. They don't think in terms of like collective action and group activity.
Like
Man.
in Australia, we have our Liberal Party who's looking like they're about, our Labor Party is looking like they're going to lose the election. No, we have a Liberal Party and the Labor Party. The Liberal Party are the right-wing fascists. So they're called the Liberals, and the Labor Party are like the Labor Party in the UK, so they're just a right-wing party that pretends to be a workers' party. Anyway, so
It's
like
all the same shit.
yeah, it's the same shit. So the Labor Party are promising to cancel a lot of student debt and do stuff for Medicare this election. And and that personally benefits me, right? A lot, because I'm a student, or I have been a student in the past, and I have student debt. But also it's like, I'm still not fucking voting for them, even though it benefits me, because they're helping manufacture F-35s that go to Israel. So like, what? I'm not fucking giving them my vote. Even if my life gets worse, I'm still not giving them the vote.
Right.
And that's on having principles.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem that hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, well, you guys want to wrap it up there? I think we got a lot done. Next time we can pick it up on the Zulu War. We'll get a little more detailed into that, and then we can start talking about the Diamond Rush, which then precedes, I think there's another gold rush in South Africa after that as well. So all
Wonderful.
the telltale signs of colonialist expansion. We got all the same things there. All right, guys, I'll see you in the Discord. Thanks for joining me. This was fun.
All right. Thanks, man.
Thanks.